a millionaire invites his cleaner to a luxury party with the intention of humiliating her. But what the woman did when she arrived left all the guests in shock. In New York City, amidst towering skyscrapers and bustling avenues, stands the grand mansion of James Collins, a powerful figure in the business world. It is in this setting of luxury and opulence that Grace Parker, a young single mother, lives and works, having found herself employed as a domestic worker in the mansion. At just 28 years old, Grace bears the determination of a life full of sacrifices, driven by the unconditional love she feels for her 8-year-old son, Michael. Every morning before the sun rises on the horizon, Grace quietly gets up, lovingly cares for Michael, preparing his breakfast and ensuring he has everything he needs for another day at the local public school. She watches him tenderly as he devours his cereal, his eyes shining with an innocence she is determined to protect at all costs. "I promise our lives will change one day, my angel," Grace whispers, gently stroking her son's hair. Michael, with a sweet smile, simply replies, "I know, Mom. You're strong." The walk to the Collins mansion is a mix of thoughts and silent prayers. Grace often wonders how much longer she can endure the coldness of James Collins and the blatant disdain of his wife, Vivian. Grace's work in the mansion is arduous, the environment oppressive, yet she carries on steadfastly, never showing any weakness. Each task, from cleaning the golden chandeliers to serving luxurious dinners to guests who ignore her, is completed with dedication and a dignity that few notice but serve as the foundation of her resilience. James Collins, a man in his early 50s, with a commanding presence and severe expression, barely speaks to Grace, except to issue harsh commands. His wife, Vivian, embodies superficiality and veiled cruelty, always casting looks of contempt toward Grace, as if her mere presence were a stain on the perfection of the Collins home. "Grace, you haven't finished cleaning the hall yet." "Hurry up," orders Vivian, in a tone that hides the insensitivity of someone who has never had to fight for anything. Despite the daily humiliations, Grace keeps her head held high. Every cruel word she receives is drowned out by the strength she finds in Michael, the reason behind all her efforts. She knows that behind the stern faces of the Collins lies an empty life, devoid of the warmth she finds in her son's smile. This certainty keeps her strong, even when she feels exhausted at the end of the day. Retreating to a small room at the back of the mansion, where she allows herself a few tears of fatigue and frustration. As night falls, after another grueling day, Grace returns home, where Michael waits for her eagerly. "How was your day, Mom?" he asks, always concerned. "It was good, sweetheart." "We're closer to our dreams," she replies, forcing a smile that masks her exhaustion. Michael doesn't notice the white lie, and Grace once again thanks the fact that he is so young and still doesn't understand the difficulties she faces. Deep in her heart, she believes that one day everything will be different. But at that very moment, as mother and son share a simple dinner, something happens at the Collins mansion that will forever change Grace Parker's destiny. A dark secret kept by James Collins for years begins to surface. And it's just the beginning of a series of events that will test all the strength and resilience Grace thought she had. The days at the Collins mansion continued with their usual routine, and Grace carried out her tasks with the same dedication as always. As she swept the main hall, the whispers of the other maids echoed through the walls, creating an atmosphere of anticipation. Did you hear? Mr. Collins is throwing a grand party. Only for the city's elite," one of them remarked, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. Grace remained silent, focused on the task at hand, but couldn't help the wave of unease that washed over her. Parties at the mansion meant extra work, and often humiliations disguised as refinement. Later, while polishing the silverware in the kitchen, Grace was unexpectedly summoned to James Collins' office. Her heart raced and a chill ran down her spine. It was rare for James to ask to speak with her directly. What did he want now? Thoughts and assumptions swirled in her mind as she walked through the imposing corridors, whose walls seemed to watch her every move. Entering the luxuriously decorated office, Grace was met by James's cold and calculating gaze. He was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, his fingers drumming on the surface as if measuring every second of his precious time. Without looking directly at her, James spoke with a tone dripping with sarcasm. "Grace, I assume you've heard about the party I'm organizing. I've decided that you should attend as one of my Special guests. Grace remained silent, too surprised to respond immediately. The proposal sounded like a trap, an opportunity for James to expose her vulnerability in front of the high society guests. The smile that formed on his lips confirmed her suspicions. And it will be a unique opportunity for you, Grace. Dress appropriately. The party is in 2 days, he added, handing her an invitation with firm fingers, as if he were doing her a great favor. Leaving the office, Grace felt the weight of the decision now resting on her shoulders. Each step to her room seemed heavier than the last. A mix of fear and indignation enveloped her, as if the invitation were a noose slowly tightening around her neck. Oh, why would he do this? She wondered, as she held the piece of paper in her trembling hands. She knew that if she refused, she might lose her job, and with it, the only way to support Michael. But if she accepted, she risked being publicly ridiculed. That night, as she prepared dinner for Michael, Grace could barely concentrate. Her mind kept drifting back to James' proposal. During dinner, Michael, always attentive, noticed his mother's worried expression. Mom, is everything okay? He asked, frowning with concern. Grace smiled at him, trying to hide her distress. Yes, sweetheart, I'm just thinking about a few things. Later, after putting Michael to bed, Grace sat at the small table in her modest living room and let her thoughts flow. Accepting the invitation would be like walking into the fire, but a flicker of hope ignited within her. Perhaps this was her chance to face her fears and show her dignity in front of those who looked down on her. After all, she had endured so much, why not this too? The next day, at dawn, Grace made her decision. With a heavy heart but determined, she headed to the maid's quarters where she kept her few belongings. She picked out a simple dress, one that held special meaning for her, the same one she had worn during an important occasion before her world turned upside down. I'll show them I'm no less than anyone else, she murmured to herself, smoothing the fabric in her hands. Throughout the day, the mansion buzzed with preparations for the party. Voices and laughter echoed off the walls, but Grace remained resolute. That night, she would face her fears head-on, not knowing that this event would be the first step towards something far greater and more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The day of the party finally arrived. The Collins mansion was abuzz with activity, with every detail meticulously arranged for the grand event. For Grace, however, this day held a completely different meaning. It was a day of courage, a chance to confront the humiliation James Collins had planned for her, and to show her true strength and dignity. Early in the afternoon, after completing her duties in the mansion, Grace returned to the small room she occupied at the back of the property. The space was modest, but there she found the comfort she needed. On her bed lay the dress she had chosen for the evening, a dress she hadn't worn in many years. It was a simple yet elegant piece that had belonged to her late mother. The fabric was soft to the touch, a deep blue that carried memories of happier times. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, holding the dress close to her chest, and closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, the image of her mother appeared with such clarity that it made her smile. She remembered the nights she would watch her mother get ready for important events, always with an air of serenity and strength. Remember, my dear, true elegance comes from within, her mother used to say. It's not the dress that makes the woman, but the confidence she carries within herself. These words echoed in Grace's mind as she stood up and began to get ready. With steady hands, she put on the dress, feeling, in a way, protected by the spirit of the strong woman her mother had been. In the mirror, Grace saw a different woman reflected back at her, someone who, despite everything, still held dignity and hope in her heart. She pulled her hair back into a simple bun, letting a few strands frame her face. With a light touch of makeup, Grace completed her transformation. It wasn't just an external change. Inside she felt stronger and more determined than ever. As she finished getting ready, the door opened quietly, revealing Michael, who stood watching his mother with eyes full of admiration. He walked over to her and, in silence, took her hand. You look beautiful, Mom, he said with a proud smile. Grace moved, knelt to be at her son's level, gently caressing his face. Thank you, my love. I'm going to need all the strength you give me, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. Michael, always sensitive and mature for his age, sensed the seriousness of the moment. Oh, Mom, you always told me we have to be brave. Show them who you really are. You're the strongest person I know. he said with a firmness that surprised Grace. This was the strength she had always tried to instill in her son. And now, seeing him return it with such conviction, renewed her own courage. Grace stood, holding her son's hand tightly. "I'll do it, Michael. For both of us." With those words, she sealed her decision. That night, she wouldn't just be the Collins maid. She would be Grace Parker, a woman determined to maintain her dignity, even in the face of adversity. As the sun set and the lights of the mansion came on, signaling the start of the party, Grace took a deep breath and added the final touches. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time, adjusted her posture, and with the image of her mother in her heart and the unwavering support of Michael in her mind, she left the room and headed toward the party that, she knew, would mark the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The night was in full swing when Grace finally reached the main entrance of the Collins mansion, now illuminated by a multitude of twinkling lights. The soft sound of classical music blended with the hum of lively conversations echoing through the vast hall. Every detail of the mansion seemed to glow with a grandeur even greater than usual, as if the house itself were prepared to witness what was to come. Grace took a deep breath before stepping inside, feeling the weight of every gaze that would turn to her in a few moments. With her head held high and her shoulders firm, she crossed the threshold, leaving the cold night air behind. As soon as her feet touched the polished marble of the foyer, a heavy silence fell over the room, followed by whispers and looks of surprise. The high society guests, dressed in their luxurious outfits and sparkling jewelry, turned to observe her in disbelief. Who is she? What is she doing here? These were the questions whispered in every corner, accompanied by malicious looks and veiled smiles. Some of the most well-known faces in James Collins' social circle stared at her as if she were an intruder, a curiosity that had somehow infiltrated their world of privilege. Grace felt the tension in every muscle of her body, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. Instead, she kept her head high and walked with an elegance that seemed to defy every malicious comment. The dress that had belonged to her mother, with its timeless simplicity, contrasted with the opulent attire around her, but rather than looking out of place, it gave her an almost ethereal presence, as if she were above the superficialities of that environment. As Grace moved through the hall, she could feel the stares fixed on her back. Some of the women present, with cold expressions and sharp smiles, looked her up and down, judging every detail. "She must be here as a joke," one of them muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. Grace, however, ignored these remarks, focusing only on moving forward. James Collins, watching the scene from a distance, couldn't help but smirk slightly. To him, this was just the beginning of a public humiliation he had meticulously planned. However, as Grace walked with unshakable dignity, some of the guests began to notice something different about her. There was a silent strength in her posture, a determination that didn't match the image of a mere housemaid. Among the guests, a middle-aged man, whose gaze had become more attentive as he watched Grace, commented to his wife, "She doesn't seem intimidated, despite everything. Maybe she's not as easy to break as James thought." His wife simply nodded in agreement, though her eyes held a hint of suspicion. As the night wore on, Grace found refuge in a quiet corner of the ballroom, near a large window that overlooked the mansion's illuminated gardens. She gazed outside, letting the sight of the trees swaying in the wind calm her racing heart. It was a necessary moment of silence, a pause amid the inner turmoil she felt. As she watched the garden, a young woman approached her, holding a glass of champagne. "You're brave to be here," the woman said, with a smile that seemed genuine. This is a tough place for someone who doesn't belong." Grace looked at the woman and smiled slightly, grateful for the gesture, but careful not to let her emotions show too much. "Sometimes we need to be where we're least expected," Grace replied, her voice steady but calm. The conversation was brief, but it left Grace with the sense that not everyone here was eager to see her fail. Still, most were waiting eagerly for her to make a misstep, something that would confirm their suspicions about her presence. Grace knew that every step from this moment on would be a test of her strength and dignity. And as the party continued, she braced herself, unaware that the challenges of the night were just beginning. Soon, the real test of her determination would reveal itself, and Grace would have to confront the darkness hidden behind the mansion's shining walls. The party continued in all its splendor, with laughter and music filling the luxurious air of the Collins mansion. The main hall was packed with influential figures, whose conversations revolved around million-dollar deals, social intrigues, and various displays of wealth. Grace, however, stood out in that environment not for what she said, but for how she carried herself. Her presence, initially seen as an anomaly, was beginning to draw attention in an unexpected way. Shortly after moving away from the window where she had found a brief moment of peace, Grace was approached by one of the guests, a middle-aged man known for his sharp sarcasm and willingness to humiliate those less fortunate. His name was Charles Wainwright, a renowned investor whose wealth was matched only by his ego. With a cynical smile, he approached Grace, accompanied by two other men, clearly interested in witnessing what seemed likely to be an embarrassing spectacle. "Ah, you must be the famous Grace Parker," Charles said, with a tone that bordered on disdain. "I've heard you've been doing a wonderful job here at the mansion. It's not every day we see a maid promoted to a guest at such an elegant party, is it?" Grace, sensing the trap in his words, kept her composure. Her smile was polite, but her eyes showed that she wouldn't be easily shaken. "I am Grace Parker, yes," she responded, her voice firm yet gentle. "And I do my job with dedication, no matter the situation. Being invited tonight was a surprise, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here." Grace's calm tone, without a hint of distress, caught Charles off guard. He had expected a defensive reaction or at the very least, some sign of discomfort, but found none of that. Intrigued, he decided to press further. "And what do you think of our little gathering, Grace? It must be quite different from anything you've ever seen," he said, with a smile that hinted at superiority. Grace held Charles's gaze, keeping her voice serene. "It's certainly an impressive event," she began, choosing her words carefully. "But, in the end, I believe the true wealth of a night like this lies in the conversations and connections we make, not just in appearances." Her comment left Charles momentarily speechless, while the two other men exchanged surprised looks. They hadn't expected Grace to respond so confidently and intelligently, turning an attempt at humiliation into a dignified reply. Before Charles could think of anything else to say, another guest, an elegant woman in a shimmering red dress, approached. "Good evening, Grace," said the woman, introducing herself as Eleanor Hastings, a socialite known for her influence in New York's highest circles. I must say I'm impressed with how you carry yourself. It's not easy to step into an environment like this and keep your head held high as you do. Where does your strength come from?" Grace, now with a larger audience, felt the curious gazes turning toward her. Once again, she took a deep breath, recalling the lessons her mother had taught her. "Strength comes from the adversities we face in life, Mrs. Hastings," Grace replied, her voice filled with sincerity. "And above all, it comes from the love we have for the people who matter to us. I do all of this for my son, Michael. He's my greatest motivation." The sincerity in her words resonated with those present. Eleanor smiled, genuinely touched. "Or, you know, Grace, I think you have a lot to teach all of us," she remarked, casting a meaningful glance at Charles, who now appeared more uncomfortable than Grace had ever been. The other guests who had gathered, expecting to witness a humiliating scene, now found themselves intrigued, respecting the woman who, in just a few minutes, had demonstrated rare dignity and intelligence. James Collins, watching from a distance, felt a twinge of concern. What he had planned as a public humiliation was turning into a platform for Grace to shine. She wasn't just withstanding the embarrassment, she was gaining the respect of the guests, something he had never anticipated. The smile that had once graced his face began to fade, replaced by an expression of uncertainty. He would need to rethink his strategy, because what initially seemed like an easy game was quickly slipping out of his control. As the night wore on, Grace continued to move through the hall, approached by other guests who, now more curious than disdainful, sought to learn more about her. Each interaction reinforced her position, and though she still felt the pressure of the environment, she knew she was achieving far more than she had imagined. However, deep down, Grace also knew that the battle was far from over. James Collins wasn't the type of man to accept being challenged on his own turf. And while the looks of respect grew around her, Grace couldn't afford to lower her guard. She was ready for whatever came next, even without knowing that the true test of her strength and resilience was only just beginning. The party was reaching its peak, with guests now fully immersed in conversations, toasts, and the soft music that filled the room. However, James Collins was not satisfied. He had been watching Grace's every move since her arrival, and what he witnessed was not what he had planned. Instead of being humiliated, Grace had gained respect. Instead of being ridiculed, she was being admired. For a man like James, this was unacceptable. Determined to regain control of the situation, James decided to take action. He would confront her in the center of the ballroom, where everyone's eyes could witness the moment when he would finally put her in her place. With determined steps, he made his way to where Grace was conversing with Eleanor Hastings and a few other guests. With a cold smile, James interrupted the conversation. "Grace, could you accompany me for a moment? I think our guests would like to know more about the woman behind so much mystery." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She knew James was up to something, but there was no way to refuse his request without appearing rude. With a nod, she accepted, following James to the center of the ballroom, where the light from the chandeliers reflected off the jewels and crystal glasses, creating a dazzling display around them. The murmurs slowly ceased, and all eyes turned to the unlikely pair standing in the middle of the room. James, ever the master of manipulation, began speaking in a tone that seemed cordial but carried a hidden intent. "Grace, you've impressed everyone tonight," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But I believe our guests would like to know a little more about you. Tell us, where do you come from? How did a woman like you end up here?" The question was laced with venom disguised as curiosity. James wanted to expose Grace's humble origins, to strip away the dignity she had worked so hard to maintain in front of everyone. However, Grace didn't let herself be shaken. She took a deep breath and kept her gaze fixed on James, knowing that every word she spoke could be used against her, but also that it was an opportunity to reveal who she truly was. "I come from a small town in the countryside, Mr. Collins," Grace began, her voice calm but firm, resonating throughout the room. "I grew up in a simple home where my mother taught me that a person's true worth lies in their integrity and their ability to face adversity with dignity." James smiled, sensing an opportunity to deepen the attack. "Must have been a hard life." "No. It must have been quite a shock for you to adapt to a place like this, so far from your roots." Grace felt the sting of his words, but remained steadfast. "Yes, it was a challenge," she admitted without hesitation. "Yes, but I believe that it is in difficulties that we find our true strength. I've learned that it doesn't matter where we are, but how we carry ourselves. And that's what I brought with me here. It's not the gilded walls or grand parties that define who we are, but our values and how we treat others." There was a disarming sincerity in Grace's words, a quiet strength that stood in stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Some of the guests, who had been eagerly waiting for the moment when she would finally crumble under the pressure, began to see the situation in a new light. What had seemed like mere social curiosity was now revealing itself to be a petty attempt at public humiliation. James, realizing that the atmosphere was no longer in his favor, made one last attempt. "Your son, Michael," he said, lowering his voice to add a more personal touch. "Must be difficult for him to grow up without a father. How do you handle that?" Grace felt the blood run cold in her veins. The attack had become personal, but she couldn't let James bring her down. With admirable emotional control, she responded, "Michael is the light of my life. Everything I do is for him. And although he doesn't have a father present, he has the love of a mother who would do anything to ensure his well-being and happiness. I believe what defines a family isn't the number of people, but the quality of the love between them." The room fell into absolute silence. Grace's words had struck a deep chord, resonating with a truth that few could contest. James's smile began to fade, replaced by a barely concealed expression of frustration. He realized that his plan was failing miserably. Instead of shaming Grace, he had exposed his own pettiness. The guests' gazes began to shift from Grace to James, but not with the admiration he was used to. There was judgment, disapproval. Eleanor Hastings, who had been observing the entire scene closely, stepped forward and, in a gesture of solidarity, placed her hand on Grace's shoulder. "You are an extraordinary woman, Grace," she said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And it is a privilege for all of us to know you." Eleanor's approval was like a signal for the others. Soon, Other guests began to express their admiration for Grace, praising her poise and the strength of her words. The respect she had earned over the past few hours was solidified, turning what was meant to be her moment of humiliation into a personal victory. James, defeated in his own trap, felt the weight of failure. What had started as an attempt to reassert his power had ended in public embarrassment, and he knew that from that moment on, Grace's position in the Collins mansion would be different. She was no longer just a maid. Grace Parker had become someone everyone there respected, and that, for James, was intolerable. As the party continued, now with a new focus of attention, Grace withdrew to a quieter corner of the ballroom, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. She had won a crucial battle, but she knew the war was far from over, and as she watched the mansion's bright lights reflected in the crystal glasses, a new determination grew within her. She wouldn't just survive this night, she would emerge from it stronger than ever. The party, which had turned into a stage for admiration for Grace's strength and dignity, took a new turn when James Collins decided that he couldn't accept his defeat so easily. The humiliation he had tried to inflict on Grace had backfired, but James wasn't the kind of man to give up without one last attempt to reassert his power. In his mind, the only way to regain control of the situation was to escalate the confrontation. When the music paused for a brief moment and the guests began to gather in the main hall for another toast, James stepped onto the small platform erected in the center of the room. With a confident gesture, he raised his champagne glass, and as he caught everyone's attention, he smiled, but it was a smile that held no joy, only the promise of something dark to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice laced with a calculated calm. "Tonight, we celebrate not just friendship and prosperity, but also the values that define who we are and the place we hold in the world." His words, rather than sounding like a celebration, carried an underlying message that did not go unnoticed by Grace. "We live in a society where each of us has our role," James continued, his tone growing more intense. "And it's undeniable that there are differences among us. Differences that go beyond appearance, that touch on fundamental issues of values, of origin, of class." The word class hung in the air like a sharp blade, cutting through the silence that had settled. The guests, previously distracted by the surrounding luxury, now turned their attention to James with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. They sensed there was more behind his words, a hidden intent that was beginning to surface. Grace, seated near the center of the room, felt her blood run cold. She knew James was targeting her directly, even without mentioning her name. It was as if he were laying the groundwork for the final blow, an attack aimed not just at hurting her, but at destroying everything she had built that night. With all eyes on him, James pressed on, his voice increasingly laden with insinuation. Some believe that these values, this distinction, can be overlooked. That with enough courage and determination, anyone can simply cross the barriers that life imposes. But is it really that simple? Is having the right attitude enough to belong in a place where you clearly don't fit? The tension in the room became almost palpable. The guests, who had been fascinated by Grace, now wondered how far James would go. The celebratory atmosphere was giving way to growing discomfort, as if everyone felt trapped in a situation from which they didn't know how to escape. Grace, however, refused to give in to the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Instead, she recalled her mother's words, the lessons of strength and resilience she had learned throughout her life. She knew this was the moment when she needed to be stronger than ever, to maintain the composure and dignity that had earned her the respect of so many in that room. Sensing that his audience was hanging on his every word, James decided to deliver the final blow. On a night like this, it's easy to forget that appearances can be deceiving, that someone can wear the right clothes, say the right words, but still be completely out of place. And in the end, what remains? Just the illusion of something that never was. Those words, more than any others, were a direct attack, and everyone in the room knew it. The gazes, which had been on James, now turned to Grace, as if waiting for her to finally succumb to the weight of his insinuations. The silence was absolute, the tension unbearable. But Grace, with a strength she didn't even know she possessed, rose slowly, with an elegance that belied the turmoil inside her. She walked to the center of the room, her steps steady, and stopped in front of James, looking him directly in the eyes. The silence in the room deepened as everyone present waited anxiously for what would happen next. "Collins," Grace began, her voice clear and firm, echoing throughout the room. "You're right about one thing. There are differences between us. But the differences that truly matter aren't those born of our origins or our social class. They are the choices we make every day, how we treat others, and the dignity with which we carry our story." Grace took a deep breath, not breaking eye contact with James. "Oh, and if I may say so, the real illusion is believing that any human being can be defined solely by their possessions or the position they hold in society. It's not the things we own that make us who we are, but our values, our courage, and our integrity." The room remained in a profound silence as Grace's words echoed in the minds of those present. What should have been a moment of humiliation had turned into a testament to the inner strength she carried. Some of the guests, again, who had previously had their doubts, now looked at Grace with renewed respect, seeing the pettiness in James's words and the greatness in Grace's response. James, on the other hand, realized he had lost control of the situation. His attempt to humiliate Grace had only served to highlight her even more. He tried to force a smile, but the tension on his face was evident. He knew he had made a mistake, and that the repercussions of that night would haunt him. As the tension hung in the air, Grace maintained her firm stance, but she knew the night was far from over. And as murmurs began to circulate again among the guests, she prepared herself for what was to come. Aware that although she had won this battle, the war with James Collins was far from finished. The room was steeped in a tense silence, each guest caught up in the dramatic moment unfolding before their eyes. James Collins, realizing his attempt to humiliate Grace had backfired, was preparing for one last strike, a final blow that, in his mind, would restore his control over the situation. He knew he couldn't let Grace win this battle, not in his own home, and certainly not in front of his peers. James stepped forward, ready to speak, but before he could utter a single word, Grace raised her hand slightly, stopping him. Surprise spread across James's face, and all eyes in the room turned to her. With surprising calm, Grace began to speak, her voice steady as she cut through the silence with the precision of a blade. "Before you say anything more, Mr. Collins, I would like to share a few words," Grace began, her stance firm, yet her eyes filled with a gentleness that contrasted with the tension in the room. "Tonight has been full of challenges for me, and I imagine for many of you as well, who perhaps have never seen someone like me at an event like this. But the truth is, who we are, where we come from, and what we do are just parts of our stories. What really matters is what we choose to do with those stories." The guests, initially uncomfortable, were now completely focused on Grace. The sincerity in her voice, the authenticity of her words, was beginning to pierce the superficial armor that many there used to protect themselves. "I come from a simple life," Grace continued, her words flowing with a clarity that could only come from someone who had lived what she was saying. "I grew up in a modest home, where my mother, a woman of great strength and courage, taught me that honest and dignified work is a blessing, not a shame. She taught me that respect for others, regardless of who they are, is the true sign of greatness." Grace paused, taking in the faces around her. Some of the guests were visibly unsettled, others began to reflect, and a heavy silence filled the space between her words. "I know that many of you see the work I do as something beneath you," Grace said, her voice soft but firm. "But I want you to know that every task I perform, every day I spend fighting for a better future for my son, is done with love and dedication. And that work, that struggle, is what gives me dignity. It's not money, it's not possessions. It's the ability to face each day with courage, to raise a child on my own, and to never give up, no matter how hard it gets." Mentioning Michael made Grace's eyes shine with an emotion she couldn't contain. "And my son is the reason I'm here today. He's the light that guides me, and everything I do for him. And I'm not ashamed to say that in front of all of you. If there's anything I'm proud of, it's being a mother who, despite all the hardships, continues to fight." The room remained in total silence, but it was now a silence filled with reflection and emotion. Grace's words were touching the hearts of many present, making them reconsider their own attitudes and prejudices. Some of the faces that had previously worn sneers now showed expressions of shame and introspection. "I'm not here to be judged or humiliated," Grace continued, her eyes shining with renewed determination. "I'm here to remind everyone that we are more than our appearances, more than our possessions. We are defined by our actions, by how we treat others, and by the respect we have for ourselves and those around us." Grace turned to James, her gaze steady and challenging. "And you, Mr. Collins, with all due respect, maybe you should consider what it truly means to be powerful. It's not the power to humiliate, to control, or to destroy. True power lies in the ability to uplift others, to show compassion, and to lead with respect." The impact of Grace's words was felt immediately. The atmosphere in the room shifted, as if a heavy cloud of prejudice and arrogance was being dispelled by the force of her sincerity. The guests, who had been waiting for a spectacle of humiliation, now found themselves confronted with a deeper truth, a reflection on their own values and attitudes. James Agg, on the other hand, found himself in an uncomfortable position. He realized that the ground beneath his feet was crumbling, that the power he so cherished was being challenged in a way he never could have predicted. Instead of having control over the situation, he had been exposed, not as a strong leader, but as someone who sought superiority at the expense of others. A murmur began to spread through the room, not of gossip, but of admiration and respect. Eleanor Hastings, who had supported Grace earlier, was the first to break the silence, clapping decisively. Soon others followed, and the sound of applause filled the room, a confirmation that Grace's words had touched everyone. Grace, still standing in the center of the room, felt a wave of emotion wash over her, but she remained composed, holding back tears. She knew she had won a crucial battle, but also that the repercussions of this moment would be lasting. The applause continued, growing in intensity, and as it did, James, now isolated, retreated to a corner, trying to hide his frustration and embarrassment. He had underestimated Grace, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance. As the night wore on, the impact of Grace's words reverberated through the Collins mansion. The atmosphere had changed, and the respect Grace had earned was palpable. She had not only defended her dignity, she had challenged everyone there to reconsider their own values, and the lesson she had imparted would not be forgotten anytime soon. The grand hall of the Collins mansion was enveloped in a heavy silence, as if Grace's words still echoed off the opulent walls. For a moment, time seemed suspended, each person present lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on what had just happened. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving everyone breathless. Then, suddenly, the silence was broken by a single pair of hands beginning to clap. Eleanor Hastings, always the first to recognize the strength of dignity and courage, initiated a steady applause, her claps echoing through the hall. One by one, the guests began to join her, until the sound of applause filled the space, growing in intensity and spreading throughout the room. For some, the act of clapping was a release of the pent-up tension, a way to express the admiration they felt for Grace, whose strength and eloquence had defied all expectations. For others, the applause was a way to atone for the shame they felt over their previous attitudes, for having been complicit, even if silently, in the attempt to humiliate her. Catherine Milford, a woman known for her cold and distant demeanor, felt a pang of shame in her chest. From the beginning of the party, she had joined in the whispers and discreet laughs that accompanied Grace's every move, believing that the young mother was nothing more than a passing distraction, someone who should know her place. Now, faced with Grace's powerful words, Catherine was forced to confront her own prejudices. She continued to clap, but her eyes were fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the woman she had so deeply underestimated. Beside Catherine, Richard Beaumont, a renowned businessman, felt a mix of admiration and discomfort. Like many there, he had been taught to value wealth and status above all else. Grace's words, however, had awakened a new awareness in him, one that made him question the priorities he had held his entire life. Richard clapped with more fervor than the others, already thinking about how he could use his position to promote real change, both in his personal life and in his social circle. Other guests, like Marjorie St. Clair, were deeply ashamed. She, who had been one of the first to whisper malicious comments when Grace entered the party, now found herself confronted by her own petty attitudes. Marjorie could barely bring herself to look at Grace, her applause weak, almost as if she were trying to redeem herself. She knew that if there was a lesson to be learned that night, it was that a person's true worth could not be measured by money or social status, but by integrity and the courage to stand up for what is right. As the applause continued to swell, James Collins, the architect of the attempted humiliation, remained motionless. He felt the ground giving way beneath his feet, a sense of defeat he had never experienced before. Everything he had planned, all his confidence in his superiority and control, had been crushed by the simple and sincere words of a woman he had deemed inferior. James couldn't understand how everything had gone so wrong. A man who had always known how to manipulate situations in his favor, he now found himself exposed, not as a powerful figure, but as someone petty and insecure. The sight of Grace in the center of the room, being applauded and admired, made his blood boil, but he was paralyzed, unsure of how to react. The humiliation he had planned for Grace had completely backfired on him. Among the guests, some approached Grace, eager to express their admiration personally. Eleanor Hastings was the first, taking Grace's hands and looking her in the eyes with rare sincerity. "And you've shown us what truly matters, Grace. Thank you for reminding us what it means to be truly dignified," Eleanor said, her voice full of emotion. Others followed suit, forming a small circle around Grace, offering words of support and respect. The circle, which had once isolated her, now closed around her like a shield of admiration and solidarity. Grace, still surprised by the turn of events, felt strengthened by each word of support she received. Among those who approached was also Richard Beaumont. "Grace, you've given us a lot to think about tonight," he said, his voice deep and respectful. "If there's anything we can do to support you, please let us know." Richard was clearly willing to offer more than just words, his mind already considering ways to help Grace and her son in a concrete way. As the guests continued to express their support, the sense of change was palpable. The atmosphere of the party, which had once been marked by ostentation and superficiality, was now imbued with a feeling of introspection and humility. Everyone there seemed affected in some way, whether by admiration for Grace or by shame for their own prejudices. James, however, remained isolated, his expression closed off. He knew that, in the eyes of many, he had lost control of the night, and that was something he couldn't accept. But for now, he had no choice but to endure the weight of his own defeat. As the night wore on, it became clear that Grace's words had left a deep mark. The party continued on, but the focus had shifted. Now it was about reflection, about how each person there could reconsider their values and perhaps make a change. Grace, with her courage and dignity, had turned a night of planned humiliation into an event no one would ever forget. And as the last echoes of applause resounded through the grand room, the impact of her words continued to reverberate in the minds and hearts of everyone present. The atmosphere in the Collins mansion was charged with a new energy, a mix of admiration, reflection, and surprise. The transformation that had taken place over the course of the evening was evident in the faces of the guests, who now looked at Grace Parker with a respect that neither she nor anyone else could have anticipated. The echo of the applause still hung in the air when a prominent figure in the social elite stepped out from the crowd and headed directly toward Grace. Sarah Thompson, a renowned businesswoman whose ventures ranged from the fashion industry to cutting-edge technology, was a woman known for her sharp intellect and her ability to spot hidden talent. With a strong presence and a gaze that conveyed both severity and compassion, Sarah had remained silent during Grace's entire speech, watching every detail with keen attention. Now she felt it was the right moment to act. She approached Grace with firm steps, drawing the attention of everyone present. It was rare for Sarah, one of the most powerful women in the country, to make such a decisive public move. The murmurs began again, with the guests speculating about what might happen next. When Sarah finally reached Grace, she paused for a moment as if wanting to ensure that everyone was paying attention. With a genuine smile and an aura of respect, Sarah extended her hand to Grace. "Grace Parker," she began, her voice firm but warm. "I've seen many people try to stand out at events like this, but I've never seen anyone turn a moment of adversity into a demonstration of strength and dignity like you did tonight." Grace, still recovering from the intensity of the last few hours, shook Sarah's hand with a slight tremble, unsure of what to expect. She realized that all eyes were now back on her. But this time, the focus was entirely different. Your speech was more than inspiring," Sarah continued, releasing Grace's hand but keeping her gaze fixed on her. "It was a wake-up call for all of us to reconsider what truly matters. And that's why I can't let this night end without doing something that I believe is more than deserved." The entire room held its breath as Sarah paused briefly, the suspense building. Grace," she finally said, her voice clear and decisive, "I want to offer you a position at my company. Not as a mere gesture of charity, but because I see in you a person with intelligence, courage, and integrity, qualities that are rare and precious. I would like you to bring those values to my team, where I'm confident you can make a real difference." The room exploded in murmurs of surprise and admiration. Sarah Thompson's offer was extraordinary, and everyone there knew what it meant. An opportunity that could completely transform Grace's life. The gesture was also a direct blow to James Collins's attempt to humiliate Grace, a public demonstration that she had not only overcome his effort to degrade her, but had emerged from it stronger and recognized. For a moment, Grace was speechless. The offer was completely unexpected, and the weight of what was happening began to settle on her. Everything she had lived through up to that moment, the hard work, the silent humiliations, the daily struggles as a single mother, seemed to culminate in that instant. It was as if life, after so much suffering, was finally opening a door she had never imagined. "Thompson, I don't know what to say," Grace began, her voice thick with emotion. "This is an incredible opportunity, and I'm immensely grateful. I never imagined something like this could happen to me, especially after everything I've been through." Sarah smiled, a smile that conveyed both confidence and encouragement. "You don't have to decide now, Grace," she said gently. "Take the time you need, but know that this offer is genuine. I want you to be part of something bigger, where your skills and ethics can truly shine." As Grace absorbed the magnitude of the offer, the guests around her began to show their support with encouraging words and smiles. Grace's perception had changed drastically. She was no longer the ignored or scorned maid. She was now an admired woman, a figure of resilience and courage, and someone who had a promising future ahead of her. James Collins, watching from afar, was paralyzed, unable to process what had just happened. What was supposed to be a night of triumph for him had turned into a complete defeat. He had lost control not only of the party but also of the narrative of the night. Grace, the woman he had tried to humiliate, had become the center of attention, celebrated by the elite he so valued. The power he believed he possessed was slipping through his fingers, and frustration consumed him. The other guests, witnessing the night's transformation, began to disperse into small groups, discussing the impact of what had just happened. Many continued to praise Grace, and some, like Richard Beaumont, began to consider how they could help build a new future for her, using their own networks. Grace, Gary still stunned, turned to Sarah, a glimmer of gratitude in her eyes. "Miss Thompson, I accept your offer, and I promise I'll do my best to honor this opportunity," she said, her voice full of determination. Sarah nodded, satisfied with the response. "I know you will, Grace, and I can't wait to see what you'll accomplish." The night, which had begun as an attempt at humiliation, ended with Grace Parker as the undisputed protagonist, a woman whose inner strength had not only protected her dignity, but also opened doors to a bright future. As the guests began to leave the mansion, taking with them the lessons of that unforgettable night, Grace remained at the center of the room, aware that her life was about to change forever. The morning sun gently illuminated the corridors of the Collins mansion, casting a golden glow over the antique furniture and luxurious carpets. The house, which had so often been the setting for grand parties and social gatherings, now seemed eerily silent, as if it sensed the imminent change that was about to take place. Grace Parker walked through those corridors with a mix of emotions. There was a sense of closure, that an important chapter of her life was coming to an end. She had already made her decision. It was time to leave behind the job that had, for so long, been her only source of livelihood. Now, with a new opportunity ahead of her, Grace knew her life was about to take a completely different direction. She was grateful for what she had achieved, but she also felt a certain heaviness in her heart at the thought of the people she would be leaving behind. Those who, like her, had dedicated their lives to serving the Collins family. Grace knew her departure would be difficult for them, but she also knew she was making the right choice. Before leaving for good, Grace knew she needed to have one last conversation. James Collins, the man who had tried to destroy her, was still in the house. And while she knew she could simply leave without saying anything, Grace felt it was important to close that chapter with dignity. She walked to James's office, where he had spent most of his time since the party, isolated and lost in his own thoughts. The door was slightly ajar, and Grace could see James sitting at his desk, his gaze fixed on some distant point. He looked different now, with slumped shoulders and a weary expression on his face. The arrogant and confident man who had tried to humiliate her seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone who was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Grace knocked gently on the door to announce her presence. James lifted his head abruptly, and for a moment surprise crossed his face. He clearly hadn't expected to see her there. "Grace," he murmured, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't slept well in recent nights. What are you doing here?" Grace entered the office with steady steps, maintaining the composure that had become her trademark. "I came to say goodbye, Mr. Collins," she said straightforwardly. "But I've decided to accept Sarah Thompson's offer, and I'm leaving my job here at the mansion." James was silent for a few moments, processing the information. He seemed older, as if the weight of the past few weeks had accelerated the passage of time. I figured this would happen," he admitted, his voice faltering slightly. "I didn't expect things to end this way." Grace looked at the man before her, noticing that the arrogance and pride that had so often defined him were gone, replaced by a vulnerability he had probably never shown anyone. She knew she could use this moment to confront him, to express all the pain and anger he had caused. But Grace also knew that wasn't the path she wanted to take. Her victory had already been won, and her dignity remained intact. "Mr. Collins," Grace began, her voice firm but calm, "I could say a lot of things right now. I could confront you. I could even humiliate you in the same way you tried to humiliate me. But I choose not to do that." James looked at her, surprised by the clarity and serenity in her words. He didn't know how to respond, unable to find the words that might ease the weight on his conscience. "I've always believed that true power comes from the dignity and respect we show to others," Grace continued. "And I don't hold a grudge because it wouldn't do me any good. I've learned that life is about choices, and I choose to move forward without carrying that bitterness with me." James looked away, clearly ashamed. I'm sorry," he murmured almost inaudibly. It was an admission he had never made before, and one he probably never would again. Grace nodded slightly, accepting his words. She didn't need more apologies or forced regret. What mattered was that she was leaving that situation with her head held high, ready for whatever came next. "I hope that one day you find peace as well," Grace said softly, turning to leave. "I'm going to say goodbye to the others now." As James watched her walk away, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss and regret. He knew that nothing he could say would undo what he had done, and that the opportunity to make amends with Grace had passed. Now, he was left alone to deal with the consequences of his arrogance and to reflect on the emptiness he had created in his own life. Grace walked through the corridors one last time, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. When she reached the kitchen, where the other employees were gathered, the news of her departure had already spread. The faces that looked at her were filled with admiration and respect. She had achieved something few there ever imagined possible, not only escaping the clutches of James Collins's power, but also emerging triumphant. Maria, the cook who had supported her countless times, was the first to embrace her, tears welling up in her eyes. "We're going to miss you, Grace," she said, her voice choked with emotion. You've always been an inspiration to all of us." Grace returned the embrace, feeling the warmth of the friendships she had built there. "I'm going to miss you all too, Maria, but I know I'm making the right choice, and I know all of you have the same strength that kept me going." The other employees gathered around, each offering their farewells and expressing the admiration they felt for Grace. She said goodbye to each one with affection, knowing she was leaving behind people who had become like a second family to her. When she finally stepped through the mansion's door, Grace paused for a moment to look at the imposing building one last time. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision, but also the freedom that came with it. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Grace felt like she was in control of her own life. As she walked down the road leading to the new phase of her life, Grace didn't look back. The chapter with James Collins was closed, and she was ready to write a new story, one that would be marked not by suffering and humiliation, but by courage, integrity, and the promise of a better future. And so, Grace Parker left the Collins mansion behind, knowing she would never have to bow to anyone again. She had won the most important battle of her life, the battle for her dignity, and now she was ready to face whatever challenges the world might throw her way. The fresh morning air filled Sarah Thompson's brightly lit office, bringing with it the promise of a new day, of a new beginning. Grace Parker sat at her new desk, still getting used to the environment that was now part of her life. Around her, the modern walls and elegant furniture stood in stark contrast to the worn opulence of the Collins mansion. Here, everything seemed to vibrate with energy and purpose, and for the first time in a long time, Grace felt like she belonged somewhere. Sarah's office was a place where ideas flourished and where hard work was recognized and rewarded. From the moment Grace accepted the job offer, she had been welcomed with open arms by colleagues who treated her with respect and consideration. There were no disdainful looks, no malicious whispers, only people who valued her integrity, intelligence, and ability to overcome challenges. Grace's work was demanding, but at the same time, it was rewarding. She had been assigned to a social project development team, where her life experiences and her passion for helping others could truly make a difference. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to learn and grow. And with each accomplishment, Grace felt her self-esteem strengthen, her confidence renewed. Michael, her son, was also thriving in this new life. With the financial stability that Grace's new job provided, he had been transferred to a better school, where he was already beginning to stand out for his intelligence and kindness. The smile he wore every day when he came home, filled with stories about his new friends and adventures, was the greatest reward Grace could ask for. One afternoon, while working on a report for a new project, Grace took a break and looked out the office window, where the New York City skyline stretched out before her. Her mind drifted back to the journey that had brought her here, from the struggles of being a single mother, the dark days at the Collins mansion, to the attempts at humiliation she had overcome. All of that seemed to belong to a distant life, but the lessons learned remained deeply rooted in her heart. She thought of all the choices she had made, choices that often seemed impossible, but were always guided by her values and the strength of character her mother had taught her. Every difficult decision, every moment she chose dignity over resentment, courage over fear, had brought her here. Grace knew her journey was far from over, but now she walked with her head held high, knowing she had the power to shape her own destiny. Her new job was just the beginning, a platform from which she could continue to build a better life for herself and Michael. She was determined to use this opportunity to make a difference, not only in her own life but also in the lives of those around her. That evening, when she arrived home, Grace found Michael sitting at the kitchen table, focused on his homework. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, his eyes sparkling with a joy that filled Grace's heart with gratitude. "How was your day, Mom?" he asked, with the same curiosity he always showed. Grace smiled and walked over, gently brushing her hand through her son's hair. "It was a good day, Michael. We're building something special, you and me." Michael smiled and went back to his studies, while Grace started preparing dinner. The kitchen, simple but cozy, was now the center of a life full of promise. Grace knew that no matter what challenges the future might bring, she and Michael were ready to face them together. As she prepared the meal, Grace reflected on how her choices had been guided by something much greater than the desire to survive. They had been guided by principles, dignity, respect, integrity, that although often challenged, had never been compromised. And now those choices had led her to a place where she could thrive, where she could offer Michael the life she had always dreamed of. When they finally sat down to dinner, Grace looked at her son, who was excitedly talking about his day at school. She smiled, feeling a deep peace in her heart. The journey had been hard, but the destination was more than she could have ever hoped for. "Are you happy, Michael?" Grace asked, her voice soft and full of love. Michael nodded enthusiastically, his eyes shining. "I'm the happiest kid in the world, Mom." Grace felt tears well up, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. "And I'm the luckiest mom in the world," she said, smiling. As night fell over the city, Grace knew she had achieved something priceless. The true value of a person, as she had always known, wasn't in their possessions, their status, or the opinions of others. It was in their character, in their choices, and in how they faced adversity. And so, with her heart full of gratitude and hope, Grace Parker closed that chapter of her life, ready to write many more. The future was full of possibilities, and she knew that, no matter what came her way, she would be ready to face it with the same dignity and strength that had guided her this far.